is Professor of Art History at the School of Arts and Aesthetics of Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi, where she teaches courses in the history of Indian painting, particularly the Mughal and Rajput schools, and the history and politics of museums. Kavita very kindly invited me to participate in a symposium she organized many years ago on the Deccan, when she did a Deccan exhibition that was a wonderful pendant to the work that we did here at the Met. So I've had a great partnership with her in so many different moments, at so many different moments. And so it's a special pleasure to welcome her here today and to welcome all of you. I'm going to hand over to Helen to start the proceedings and welcome everybody.
Thank you so much, Navina. So as we mentioned before, this is a pre-recorded talk. So you should all be able to see my screen. Please do let me know if you have trouble hearing.
Right. Oh, can I just jump in to say,
sure.
although this is a pre-recorded talk, Professor Singh is actually with us as well. So she will be taking a Q&A at the end, and she's very much here. So welcome to her. Thank you.
Okay.
I'm absolutely delighted and honored by Navina's invitation to speak in this series with this very beautiful title, Islamic Art in Solitude. And I want to thank Navina, first of all, for thinking of including me in this. I also want to thank Helen for everything that she has done towards facilitating this talk. And I want to thank all of you for being here today. And I want to crave your indulgence, because the paintings that I want to discuss today are not ones in which I have any great depth of scholarship, but these are paintings that attract and puzzle me. And I want to offer you today only a tentative and a preliminary kind of speculative exploration by raising some questions about these paintings, to most of which I actually have no answer. But by way of explaining why I wanted to blunder into this area, let me just start by showing you the kinds of paintings that I find so very interesting and that I just absolutely felt I had to, despite my ignorance, explore. So this is a painting that is made in the 18th century, late in the 18th century, in Awadh, which is one of the centers in North India whose fortunes rise as the Mughal Empire declines and the center fails to hold. The museum that holds this painting has given it the title An Entertainment in a Palace Garden. And it is a painting of an incredible vista. In the foreground, we see a princess sitting on a golden seat, smoking a hookah, while being ministered to by a number of attendants. She's watching an entertainer who's performing a dance which includes some feats of balancing and jugglery, because there's a bottle very precariously perched on her head, while musicians are providing her a beat for her dance. But what's happening in the foreground really seems only to be an excuse to produce what's happening in the background, where there is a dazzlingly immense cityscape that unfolds. We see here garden after garden, where there are blooming flowers and pleasure pavilions behind high walls. There are canals filled with lotuses. There are orchards. There are fountains. Most of the gorgeous pavilions here are set with floor spreads and cushions, but nobody's sitting on them. In fact, the painting is oddly unsettling, because when you look at it, you see all these spaces that are made to be used and inhabited, almost all of which are empty of people. Only on one quiet street in the background, we see a male horse rider and his attendants waiting patiently as the covered palanquins and carriages bring women to a garden. And there is a qanat, or a tented wall, erected across the road to shield the women as they disembark and walk to the garden's gate. In the far background of this painting, another universe unfolds. And in fact, you could say that in the distant landscape, the river and the land across it is actually busier. There's more activity here. We see bridges, we see boat traffic, we see sugarcane fields, we see Persian wheels, we see a man combating a water monster, and we see a lion hunt all taking place in the background. I think you'll agree with me that while the ostensible subject of this painting is of an entertainment in the zenana of a palace, the real protagonist of this painting is space. And I feel that I could spend hours exploring all the rooms and the niches and the gardens in this painting. But not everybody who's written about this painting is equally appreciative of it. The great Mughal scholar Stuart Carey Welch, who was also the keeper of Islamic art at the Met, and who did such a lot to bring so many offbeat paintings to the notice of connoisseurs. About this painting, he had this to say: European scientific perspective struck Faizullah, the artist of this painting, with the force of a custard pie. Befuddled by its principles, but thrilled with their effects, he peppered the composition with vanishing points, and he created a boundlessly staccato view of a Mughal heaven on earth. Now, at the center of this painting, as Stuart Carey Welch points out, the artist has actually signed his name, Faizullah, right on the point of an archway that leads, in the words of Welch, to a tunnel of subterranean delights. And he calls this a tunnel because the perspective shifts here, where the arch seems to lead, kind of like Alice in Wonderland, to another landscape altogether, which has its own river and its own further shore. So what is going on here? Now, we know hardly anything about who Faizullah was, apart from a handful of paintings that are signed by him, and several others that we assume have some connection with him or his workshop, because they have a very similar ambitious scope. The painting that we have been looking at is with the Aga Khan Museum in Toronto, but we come across something very, very similar in the Chester Beatty Library in Dublin, where a similar dancer balances a bottle on her head for a very similar princess, and the dance is set in a very similar scene, but this time the format is vertical. But this landscape of idyllic pavilions and of gardens as far as the eye can see, this river, and on the far side of the river, we see an emperor, presumably on elephant back, perhaps riding towards this disturbing scene of a fortress being besieged, and even scattered on the plain before this fortress, the bodies of fallen soldiers. This in many ways echoes the things that we have seen in the Aga Khan Museum painting. And then we have another painting in the Chazen Museum, whose idyllic foreground similarly contrasts with figures in the deep background, because we see in the foreground an entertainment in a palace. There is a princess listening to a musical concert. And then in the background, we see again sea monsters and horses battling, but we see also a fortress, and we see an army leaving a fortress being led by somebody on elephant back. I think the fort in this case that is shown in the background may even be the fort of Delhi, because there are similarities in the architecture of the main gateway, and the army that leaves it seems to be on its way to do battle. There's also a painting in the David collection in Copenhagen, and this, on the other hand, seems to show more people occupying different parts of the palace in the foreground. You have delicious pleasures being shown in the middle ground, like this lady who is having her feet tickled or caressed. And the only violence, again, seems to be in the background, this time simply centering around that threatening aquatic creature that seems ready to swallow a horseman, while his friends are rallying to his aid. The contrast between this idyll in the foreground and disturbances in the background is taken even further in this painting that we are looking at, which is now in the Cleveland Museum of Art, where the frolicking women in the foreground both give and take pleasure. They give pleasure to the voyeur viewer while taking pleasure in the water and in each other. There are mehfils taking place in the palace that is behind them. But in the far background, there is again a besieged fort with a huge snaking army, this time marching past the pleasure gardens and over a bridge to the scene of the battle. This time, however, the soldiers seem to be wearing East India Company army uniforms. And where there would have been a Mughal emperor or Badshah on elephant back in the previous paintings, here it looks like the commander on the elephant is an English sahib. Although the name of Faizullah is associated with many of these elaborate terrace scenes, this interest in complex and layered architecture and these kinds of topographical backgrounds is in fact seen in a huge range of images that must have been made by many, many artists. And in this slide, I've put in a kind of a teaser to prepare you for more images with similar deep backgrounds, some of which will come up for a little more discussion later today in my talk. When we see enough of these paintings, we realize that they were not an occasional diversion, but they were a major preoccupation of their time, that is from about 1760 to 1780 or so, and in their place, which was Awadh, this former Mughal province, which had newly begun to test the limits of its independence as a sovereign state that didn't have to be subservient to the Mughals anymore. Now, already from the 4 terrace scenes that we were looking at, we can see a pattern in the way that they are organized, in which the bird's eye view gives us a glimpse into the charmed life of a zenana in the foreground, while in the far distance, we get a glimpse of a world outside the palace, a world in which we can see labor and war and danger. So it's clear by the way these paintings are all organized in this format that they actually belong to a developed genre that seems to have established its own conventions and its own messages that are as layered as the scenes and the spaces and the buildings that they depict. So what are these paintings? What might their significance be? Why did this kind of evocation of deep space become so popular at this time? I'd really like to know. And I may not be able to provide definitive answers, but I want to share with you some speculations about this. So first of all, let's try and understand what was the context in which these paintings were produced. All of the paintings that we have been looking at are believed to have been made in Awadh in the 1760s, 1770s, some decades after this former province of the Mughal Empire, along with a few other provinces, had become independent kingdoms in all but names. And the Subedar Nawabs, or the governors of these subas and provinces, had become sovereigns, again, in all but name. Seizing the opportunity that was provided by the weakening of the Mughal center, several of these subedars were testing the limits of their power. And in many cases, the tribute that they should have been sending to the central exchequer actually stayed with them, creating regional pockets of wealth. These kingdoms, which are forged out of the former provinces of the Mughal Empire, are called the provincial Mughal kingdoms. They offer some kind of symbolic respect and tribute to the increasingly shaky Mughal throne. Yet the cultural forms that are associated with the Mughal center, the forms of architecture and art, the forms of literature and music, the forms of courtly comportment, of dress and of ornament, carry such prestige that while these provincial Mughal kingdoms are breaking away from Mughal control politically, culturally, instead of breaking away from Mughal norms, they to a very large extent reproduce them in their own spheres. Now, historians used to speak of the 18th century and this fragmentation of the Mughal Empire as a period of Mughal decline. But now it is actually seen more as a period of regional efflorescence, where the decentralization of power actually allowed multiple centers of patronage to arise, which then offered opportunities to many more artists, more poets, more dancers, more musicians, more jewelers, more kinds of creative people. And so rather than just being seen as a period of the loss of the might of a centrally important imperial power, this is actually seen as a period of great cultural gain over many parts of India, because each of these new rulers had to assert his own sense of being cultured. And he had to be a connoisseur of music and of gems and of poetry and painting. And he had to have a fine library that was stocked with beautifully made books. And so artists' workshops coalesced in each of these new centers, continuing and extending the tradition that had started at the Mughal court. This is something that we see in the former Mughal provinces of Awadh that we are talking about today, but equally it happened in other provinces, for example, in Bengal, where the capital was at Murshidabad, and further south in the Deccan in Hyderabad as well. Now, Awadh was one of the most prosperous subas or provinces of the empire. It controlled the land between the two major rivers in the north, the Yamuna and the Ganga. This land was incredibly fertile and productive, and the rivers were very important waterways on which boat traffic carried grain and other goods. In 1722, the governorship of this Suba of Awadh was given by the Mughal emperor to Saadat Khan, who was an Iranian warrior who was in Mughal service. And although this post of being the governor was supposed to be an appointment that could be given and taken away by the Mughal emperor, in practice, from Saadat Khan onwards, it became a hereditary title that passed down through generations of his family. Saadat Khan was followed by his son-in-law Safdarjung. Safdarjung was followed by Shujauddaulah. Shujauddaulah was followed by Asafuddaulah, and so on and so forth. And in the 1760s and 1770s, when our terrace scenes were made, Shujauddaulah was on Awadh's throne. The capital at that time was at Faizabad. It's only under Shujauddaullah's son Asafuddaulah that the capital shifts later to Lucknow. Now we know that artists from Delhi had been flocking to Awadh since the 1740s, since the time that the Iranian Nadir Shah had carried out a devastating invasion of Delhi in 1739. If artists from Delhi had come to Awadh in the 1740s, then the terrace scenes of the 1760s and 1770s would be the work of a second generation of artists whose parents had come to Awadh from Delhi. They had brought to their work all the training and the finesse of Mughal painting. They had been using their techniques and their skill to please and flatter the new patrons that they had found, to praise their achievements. But this second generation, born and bred in Awadh, had also begun to modify the Mughal style to make something that was especially of the place in which they found themselves. Now, among the great achievements of the Nawabs of Awadh, as they increased in power and wealth, was the rapid urbanization of the area. And historians speak about the way in which both Shujauddaulah and Asafuddaulah actually set about altering the physical face of the land of Awadh. The skyline began to change. There was the arrival of fortresses and palaces and mausoleums. So perhaps paintings like these actually record the reality of a rapidly transforming urban space. If we look at the cityscape here, we do notice how, despite the profusion of all the trees and flowers over here, everything is fitted into a display of an ordered and urbanized space. Because on this side of the river, all the broad roads are meeting at right angles, and everything that is natural is ordered into a neat geometrical form. The flowers are all in these rectangular beds in gardens. The trees are all planted in neat rows in the orchards. Each structure in this sprawling urban scape is a space for pleasure, or for leisure. There are terraces, there are pavilions, there are gazebos, while agricultural fields or untamed empty land or constructions that are connected with anything but pleasure, like mosques or forts or tombs or wells, places of worship, places of education, defensive structures, mausolea for the dead, or structures that are connected with the practical needs of life, all of these are practically all relegated to the further shore. The urban density that we are seeing depicted in these paintings, the way in which every inch of space is ordered and seems tamed, to me stands in stark contrast to paintings that are made by one of the same artists in Awadh at the same time, where he has depicted an imagined scene of Mughal Delhi of a few decades prior, before his father's generation would have fled Delhi. In this imaginary scene, which is depicting an event from the time of Muhammad Shah, the Mughal emperor who is blamed for Mughal decline and on whose watch Nadir Shah actually invaded Delhi, we are seeing in this scene the zinana of Muhammad Shah heading out for a picnic. The women have arrived by boat, which we see in the river in the foreground, and they are going towards a garden. Strangely, Muhammad Shah's mother is shown riding a bullock, while a royal woman who resembles very closely another portrait which is identified as Udam by Muhammad Shah's third wife, is sitting quite unaccountably near what looks like a puddle, just on the ground, without any sign of a carpet or a seat or a throne. In the background, we see an all-woman team assembling a tented enclosure around the garden. And though the garden is near some high-walled structures, the space in which the garden and these buildings have been set is very desultory. The angle that is chosen by the artist shows attractive buildings, it shows well-planted gardens, but it shows all of them set in a landscape of mud and puddles and sand. And this is quite unlike the perfectly regulated and completely controlled space in the Awadhi terrace scene. Now, in a recent essay, Nicholas Roth has placed contemporary poetry beside these paintings to compare the description of architecture in poetry and in painting. And it turns out, he finds, that the poetry is hyperbolic, but it is imprecise, because it speaks of buildings that are as light as bubbles or as high as mountains. Painting, on the other hand, has to be precise, because if the artist has to place a roof upon a column, he has to make a decision about the shape of the column, the size of the roof, whether the column has a capital, is ornamented or not. But then, as the scholar Chanchal Dadlani has shown in her essay of paintings of architecture of this time, painting can be highly precise, so the artist can make decisions about what kind of column and what kind of roof he's going to paint. But in late 18th century Awadh, the artists routinely overlay the buildings with a lot of ornamentation, regardless of whether or not the buildings that they are depicted actually have that ornamentation. So paintings are precise, but they are also formulaic in the way they describe buildings. So they need not be necessarily trusted as a documentary source. So this is just to say that when we see a highly regulated, highly ornamented, highly perfected urban architecture being depicted by the artist, that's not necessarily how the cities actually looked at that time. Because clearly, even though Awadhi cities were developing and they were undergoing transformations, they did not quite look as orderly as the image that we are seeing on the left. In fact, poets who migrated from Delhi to Lucknow bemoaned the loss of the great city that they had left behind. The poet Mir Taqi Mir says that the ruins of Delhi are far better than the buildings of Lucknow, and he rues the madness that has brought him there. Another poet who made the similar journey from Delhi to Lucknow, Mir Hassan, said, each lane is so narrow here that even the wind cannot pass through. And the sludge in the lanes is black with mud, like sweat from the body of an Ethiopian. So these poets are actually critical of the new cities of Awadh, while the painters render images of dizzying perfection. So this dissonance between the image that is created by the painters and the image that is created by the poets is also something that deserves to be explored. As of now, the only very obvious explanation that comes to my mind is that words are cheap. They are much cheaper to produce than paintings at any rate. And so an acerbic comment that is made by a poet can be made in his own time, in his more personal writing. And the more public words that he has to present to his patron would have been perhaps much more flattering. But for painters, on the other hand, whose paintings need patrons to sustain them because it can take months, it requires a lot of expensive material to make a finely detailed painting. It may not be so easy to turn to satire and scathing commentary about the very forces that are expected to support them. Though painters might subtly mock ex-patrons, as I believe the painting of the Muhammad Shah Zinana picnic is doing, where the Awadhi artist is making fun of the erstwhile patron of his ancestors, showing his family getting its feet muddied, quite literally, as it were. The painting on the left then, and others like it, are hyperbolic because they don't just document the developing urban reality of Awadh, but they also make a kind of a flattering statement about cities as tropes. Now, the great terrace scene paintings of Faizabad historically are actually contemporary with very great building projects of Shujauddaulah. In 1765, the Nawab actually embarked upon an extensive building campaign in Faizabad, where he razed the old citadel to the ground and he erected lofty buildings in its stead. He defined a 2 square mile area around the citadel, and he told his officers and his retainers to make their homes there. The city walls that were made by him were no less than 10 meters thick. The fine houses that were built by his officers were all made of white lime. They were decorated with frescoes and gold paint. But even at their grandest, these fine, elaborately decorated white buildings only superficially resembled the marble palaces of the Mughals because they were made of much cheaper and less permanent materials of lime and brick. But they were a huge improvement on what had gone before, because 40 years earlier, when the founder of this dynasty, Sadat Khan, had become the governor of Awadh in 1722, he lived in a tent. And the more solid structure that he decided to build to pass the monsoons was just a wooden hut with a thatched roof. Now, it comes as a shock to actually look at the historians of urban India and to realize how routine it was for Mughal nobility to have this kind of shifting and very provisional residential architecture. Francois Bernier, the French physician who served the Mughal court in the 17th century, observed that very few of even the richest in Mughal India actually built their houses of stone or even brick. Most of them lived in houses that were made of clay and straw. They had roofs that were supported by canes or bamboos, and the walls were simply plastered lime over mud. When we read articles on domestic architecture in 17th century Mughal India, we find how surprisingly unimpressive the houses of the wealthy could be. The architectural historian Kathy Asher tells us about how very rarely even the richest of Mughal noblemen made grand structures for themselves in the provinces where they were posted. And this was because there was a deliberate policy of frequent transfer for these officials to prevent them from striking deep roots in any one particular place, getting too many supporters, or developing strongholds of their own. And governors who had the temerity to make grand buildings for themselves to live in were mostly punished by the Mughal emperor. Now, Ebba Koch's very brilliant work on Mughal architecture adds even more detail to our understanding of the uneven development of architecture under the Mughals. She explains this system of escheat, under which technically nothing is owned by Mughal noblemen. All of their properties are granted to them by their sovereign, and on their deaths, everything reverts to the crown. And then it's on the emperor's pleasure that the property enjoyed by the father is given or not given to the son. So since ownership of property was so insecure, it actually discouraged any kind of investment in building immovable property. And Koch's work tells us that only tombs were exempt from this rule, because it was considered impious to disturb a tomb that had been built by a nobleman for himself. So a tomb could be built, and then its future maintenance and ownership could be settled in a trust or a waqf, which could then be controlled by the nobleman's family. And so building tombs on family estates became a method of securing the property, actually, leading to more resources being poured into architecture for the dead rather than for the living. By the late 18th century, the power of the Mughal emperor had waned. The balance of power had shifted. It had even become inverted, because it was the emperor who was now anxiously hoping that he still had the support of his provincial governors. And the governorates had in turn practically become hereditary. The development of provincial Mughal dynasties now ushered in an era of settled confidence. And this was expressed in an efflorescence of architecture in all of the provinces, where cities grew and public works like bridges or canals or hospitals or places of worship or sarais were built. But along with that, the de facto sovereigns of the provincial Mughal states also began to build extensive palaces and garden complexes for themselves. Crucially for us, this was then expressed in the representation of architecture. And paintings that delight in space, that celebrate urban vistas, and that multiply what might have been just a handful of palaces or havelis into a tremendous multitudinous architecture. Paintings that show this are seen not just in Awadh, which we have been looking at, but practically everywhere else. So if we look at the other provincial Mughal states, we encounter this same interest in depicting deep landscapes and vast vistas and immense palace complexes. Perhaps it's not carried to the same extent as in Awadh, but we do encounter this in Hyderabad, which produces paintings that are very similar in spirit to the Awadhi terrace scene. In this painting from Hyderabad, we're seeing an absolutely symmetrical garden that looks onto a river, beyond which a rather European city is sitting upon the Deccan plain. And then there is this painting, also from Hyderabad, which is a fabulous scene showing Asaf Jah II going with his entourage from Hyderabad to the Golconda Fort. And if in the previous painting, the city in the distance looked like something taken directly from a European print, in this painting, the sense of a particular place is captured not just in the way it reflects the architecture of the Golconda Fort, but also in the way it represents the fabulous natural rock formations in the region, as was pointed out by Navina Heather in a wonderful talk that she gave on this recently. So then there is also this remarkable manuscript also from Hyderabad of the Tuzuki Asafya that describes the rule of Asaf Jah II. And it has this incredibly detailed fold out view, which is both cartographic and schematic of the city of Hyderabad, where at its center, we see the Nizam receiving a French visitor in his palace, while the teeming city around him prominently shows all the Shia shrines that are flourishing under his protection. So in Hyderabad, in Awadh, in Murshidabad, the autonomy that is brought by the 18th century ushers in a new era of urban development. And the deep vistas that are shown in paintings from here, or the rolling landscapes of infinitely extending towns, do not simply reflect growing wealth or increasing urbanization of these places or their ambitious architectural projects at the time, but they actually express a new relationship with space, with place, and with territory. Whether they are based on actual topographic information like the granitic rocks of the Deccan, or whether they are based on the fantastical imaginings of an infinitely stretched pleasure garden in Awadh. These images help to turn places into logos by associating an image vocabulary with a particular place. This impulse to make territory visible, to turn it into a set of motifs, must have been part of a conscious project on the part of painters, poets, patrons, as they all became self-conscious about their part in creating a new center in what had earlier been the provincial margins of empire. So this is a project of place making, in which the actual architectural achievements on the ground are celebrated, but are also exaggerated, or perhaps even anticipated, because representations in painting of architectural vistas probably raced ahead of facts on the ground, presenting viewers visions of a perfected cityscape that has already been achieved on paper, while the actual city was probably still a place that's full of building material and dust and architectural intentions. Now, we should take a step back to remember that while a lot of the provincial Mughal governors in the high Mughal period had very insecure hold over the provinces where they were posted, there were some kinds of Mughal governors who had secure land holdings for decades and even for centuries before Awadh or Hyderabad or Murshidabad did. And these were the Rajputs, who had the Hindu rulers, who were the traditional rulers of a lot of territories that the Mughals sought to conquer, who then made strategic alliances early on with the Mughals. And as part of the treaties that were offered to them, were allowed to retain their traditional kingdoms as their Watan Jagir, or ancestral land holdings that were granted to them in perpetuity. A Rajput ally typically spent most of his life far away from his Watan Jagir. He was out on campaigns and postings like any other officer, but he did retain a secure holding over his ancestral territories for his family. And he was presumably given more freedom within these land holdings. And he could then invest money and efforts in building fine forts and palaces in these homelands, even if he was passing his life in more modest and temporary quarters in the Mughal frontiers. And this might explain why today, when we travel as tourists in North India, it is in Rajasthan that we see so many imposing forts and beautiful palaces that have been built right through the 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th centuries, the time of the Mughal heyday, whereas we see far fewer of these palaces in other areas that were under direct Mughal control. Now, given the intertwining of architecture and the representation of architecture in painting in forms of placemaking. Is it any surprise that in those Rajput territories, which exercised sovereignty over their own lands much before the provincial Mughal states did, this celebration in painting of the achievements in brick and stone actually began much earlier in Rajput centers than they did in provincial Mughal ones. In Mewar, for instance, the fabulous large-scale topographical paintings had begun to be produced right at the start of the 18th century. The earliest may date to 1700, and they are followed by such a dense sequence of large-scale, intensely observed and carefully worked out paintings that scholars can actually trace year-by-year additions and alterations to the palace structure. In the two paintings that we are seeing here of the city palace in Udaipur that are from 1700 and 1705, the architectural scholar Shikha Jain shows how architectural changes, such as the addition of a Mughal-style garden in one part of the palace, is so meticulously recorded by the artist of the later painting that you can use these paintings to track the renovations and alterations in the palace. Udaipur paintings enrapturement with its own city, its landscape and architecture are a continuing theme that we see from 1700 going right into the photographic age. Andrew Topsfield has spoken of these vast paintings that show processions and hunts and ceremonies unfolding in a clearly recognizable architectural landscape. Dipti Khera more recently has spoken about these paintings as endeavoring to capture the bhav or the essence of a place. Mewar's scopic vision is one of the most fascinating chapters in the history of Indian painting. And its interest in the specificity of place and architecture makes buildings dominate the composition. And yet, you find that compositional and iconographic techniques used by the artist make these images sometimes appear like mandalas, so that despite the prominence of architecture, the ruler within it somehow remains prominent, where he becomes like that energy that is powering the whole field at the center of the mandala. In cases like these, the composition actually seems to emanate from the powerful human at its heart. And this is very different from Awadh, where the buildings actually seem to dwarf the human figures that are within them. Now, painting from Udaipur actually has a unique take on space and place and architecture and topography, but other Rajput kingdoms also show an interest in exploring deep space, and they celebrate their palaces, their cities in their own ways. For example, when a prominent artist from the Mughal atelier of Muhammad Shah arrived in the kingdom of Jodhpur, he produced for his new patron a flattering portrait that revised the exact format of the painting that he had made for the Mughal emperor. But if you see the Mughal emperor on the left and you see the Jodhpur Maharaja on the right, you see that he places the Maharaja on a golden throne while the emperor had sat on a carpet. The artist takes pains to expand the courtyard and to suggest a large orchard beyond the archway for the Maharaja, and nearly double the number of entertainers who are performing for Maharaja Abhay Singh compared to the much smaller and more intimate gathering that is shown for the Mughal. Marwar's interest, this kingdom of Marwar's interest in space, is to take many forms over the succeeding decades, from the vast panoramic paintings of narratives from Hindu myths like the Krishna Leela or the Ramcharitmanas or the Durga Charit that are made for the ruler Vijay Singh, to the rather Mewar-like crystalline depictions of palace and temple scenes under Maharaja Man Singh in the 19th century. This excursion into Rajput schools would be incomplete without a quick look at Kishangarh, where again, émigré artists from the Mughal court transfer the vocabulary of Mughal painting, this time to devotional rather than to royal themes. We're seeing here a painting from a Rukmini Mangal series that celebrates the god Krishna's elopement with the princess Rukmini. But the setting and the details of this painting could be mistaken for a Shah Jahani painting, were it not for the presence of a blue-skinned god sitting at the heart of the courtyard. Just compare the background of this scene with the far background of a conquest scene from the Padshahnama, which is the great manuscript of Shah Jahan's life. While we see on the left, the Padshahnama, where there is a scene of a campaign against a fortress, and we see an army with its equestrian and elephant-backed forces over here in the Shah Jahani painting. We see on the right-hand side, the Kishangarhi painting, where Krishna is conferring with his brother and his allies inside the palace, and a very similar scene of teeming armies is depicted outside. Later, as Kishangarhi painting develops its own stylized character, a royalized Radha and Krishna will be seen on marble terraces and pavilions rather than in pastures and meadows. And there comes a kind of a double appropriation here, where Mughal-style vistas show the marble palaces that the Kishangarh royals had the power to make for themselves, and the divine figures of Radha and Krishna are dressed like Kishangarhi royals, collapsing the imperial with the provincial and the royal with the divine. Now, this quick tour of Mewar, Marwar, and Kishangarh, I hope, shows some of the qualities that we associate with provincial Mughal painting, with its interest in architecture and deep space, were actually already present several decades earlier in the Rajput domains. So here in these Rajput domains, a celebration of the region's fine buildings, a kind of a scopic vision that grasps vast territories, a kind of a visual vocabulary that turns landscape into a logo, is already seen. One could argue that the extensive depiction of architecture in Mewar or Marwar or Kishangarh are just set in a different context, and they answer different needs than the depiction of very similar extensive spaces that we see later in Awadh or in Murshidabad or Hyderabad. But I'm coming to think that making this kind of distinction is an error. Because if we confine our interpretation of the Awadhi terrace scenes with deep landscapes to a broadly Muslim cultural sphere, and we interpret it in the context of power shifts or of Persian poetry, which describes landscapes and architecture, we would actually be missing a very large part of its context, because it would be to ignore what we know about how closely the Rajput and the Mughal worlds were intertwined, and how Rajput and Shia and Sunni governors and officers of the Mughal realm all served together. They lived in the same encampments, and they looked perhaps enviously at each other. So when we look at the 18th century provincial Mughal states, and we see their adoption of courtly splendor, and their patronage of architecture, and their investment in placemaking, I think that it's a mistake to imagine that in doing all of this, they only wanted to emulate their Mughal overlords. Because perhaps they are playing a catch-up game also with their Rajput neighbors, who have already been enjoying a sovereignty over their regional holdings, and that the provincial Mughals are only just beginning to grasp. In another sense, Mughal and Rajput traditions were also more aligned than we normally admit. It's easy to see how the Mewar artist manipulates space so that his depiction of a palace is simultaneously richly descriptive and also deeply symbolic. But it is precisely this mix that also underlies Mughal use of backgrounds and landscapes as well. Even if the forms are different, the intentions, the multi-layered meanings in the backgrounds are very similar. Because for a very long time, the part of the painting that we consider the background in Mughal art has already been a place that is filled with coded meaning and significance. And so to explain this, please indulge me while I turn to a very brief history of what we understand about depictions of landscape and other backgrounds in the classical period of Mughal art. So many mature paintings from the Akbar period show deep backgrounds where a landscape endlessly unfurls itself. And scholars point to European prints that would have been the inspiration for this, but Ursula Weeks very rightly understands what motivates the adoption of this deep landscape when she calls this point of view the God's eye view, that the one who holds this painting holds the key to sharing that omniscient perspective which allows you to look so far into the distance. Add to this what Mika Natif has taught us about what she calls the micro-architecture in Akbari landscapes, where she shows how the diversity of building types in these tiny details actually relates to Akbari concepts of universal harmony, which was a pillar of his governance and which was very vital for the long distance trade that led to prosperity in his time. Under Jahangir, the painter seems to move closer to his subject, curtailing the descriptive use of deep space, but he also suggests imperial control of the world, literally the meaning of Jahangir's name, Jahan, world, Caesar, Gir, by using cartographic tools like the map and the globe as implements that are either held in Jahangir's hand or are placed under his feet. Now in Shah Jahan's time, particularly in the Padshahnama, that magnificent manuscript of his life, there is a return to a deep space which is seemingly descriptive, but there too, backgrounds are full of meaningful details. For example, the irrigation here relating to prosperity brought by good governance in his reign. So in Mughal art, even as style keeps shifting, the role of background space in these paintings remains one of a screen on which to project the king's wisdom and authority through a series of interventions that turns the landscape into a moralized space. Now, if we look at this detail of a siege in the Padshahnama, which has this heap of crumpled bodies that I've highlighted in the detail on the right, these bodies sprawled on a low rise, it makes me think of one of the Faizabad terrace scenes that we were looking at a little while ago. And this resemblance cannot be coincidental because the conical fortress on the hill, the ring of cannons, the fallen soldiers, they all seem to pick up details from various Padshahnama paintings and turn them into a trope that get repeated across paintings in Faizabad. When we look at these side by side, we should put aside judgments of drawing and brushwork and just see the motifs traveling from one painting to another. We need to recount how the Padshahnama manuscript itself was in Awadh at this time. It would be gifted by the Nawab to the British monarch only in 1799. But what is it that makes the Padshahnama a source from which this scene of sieges and tropes of battles get repeated again and again in the backgrounds of these beautiful paintings that have these idols in the foreground? We see these disturbing backgrounds of war in so many of the Faizabad paintings. We see them in the paintings of entertainments on a terrace. We see it in the painting of the ladies bathing in the pool. We see it in this scene of a lady having her feet massaged. We see it in this scene of a musical concert. And we see it in this fantastic scene, which includes Laila and Majnu sitting in the middle ground, while there is a palace entertainment in the foreground as usual. Now, to try and understand these repeated references to warfare, I tried to make a list of the major invasions that hit India at this time. Because the histories I was reading were Mughal-centric, I was able to make a list of invasions that were aimed at the Mughal capital in Delhi. We hear so much about the invasion of Nadir Shah in 1739, but just look at the situation 10 years later, where there follows a period of almost continuous attack by the Afghans and the Jats and the Rohingyas and the Marathas and the British. This is a Delhi-centric list, but it obviously involves Awadh as well, because the Nawabs of Awadh still attempted to defend the Mughal center. And often when the Mughal center lost, the Nawabs of Awadh often had to pay penalties for defending the Mughals after this inevitable defeat. Then in 1759, the reigning Mughal monarch was assassinated by his own vizier, who put a puppet on the throne. And the Mughal crown prince, fearing for his life, escaped to Awadh, where he was recognized as being the rightful heir to the throne. But he was unable to return to Delhi for 13 years. And so for 13 years, he was stationed in Awadh, using the fort near Lucknow and Faizullah, the fort of Allahabad, as his base. And the Nawabs of Awadh were ceaselessly involved in battles and negotiations on his behalf. So surely the tremors that were felt at this time travel across the earth, under the river, and snake under the foundations of these fantastical palaces and make themselves felt in every pavilion and on every terrace. The wonder is that the besieged fortress and the lumbering armies are shown as far away as they are. The activities that they denote would have concerned everybody at Awadh, whether it was the king or the commoner alike, because they had the potential of erupting into everybody's lives. The marvelous terrace scenes of Faizabad are made precisely during the time that the exiled Mughal crown prince Ali Gauhar, who will later come to the throne as Shah Alam, is living in Awadh. So the references in all of these paintings to sieges make sense. And so do the distant processions where the emperor is shown going about his business on the further shore, processing on elephant back, going on a lion hunt, as we see here, which was also an imperial privilege, because the emperor was present, or the emperor in all but name was present, and he was marching, he was campaigning, he was importuning, he was hunting, he was being hosted and feasted in Awadh, even as Awadh was testing its own independence from him. An ironical commentary on this situation is supplied by this painting that shows a typically Awadhi terrace scene with the fort of Delhi lumbering on the further shore. What does this mean? The scene is peaceful. There are no wars in the background. The figures on the bank of the Yamuna River are performing entertainment for what must be an imperial figure who is sitting in this central pavilion, the imperial pavilion or the Shah Burj of Delhi's Red Fort. You see a detail here where you can see that the figure who occupies this space has no discernible halo. And the fort and the emperor within his pavilion, we know from this genre of paintings, has been placed in the position of the real world, a place full of problems that this genre likes to push into the distance. So you have the Awadhi idyll in the foreground, and you have that troublesome Delhi in the background of this painting. I had conjectured that this interest in space was the artist's way of creating new centers of urbanization and urbanity, or celebrating new centers of urbanization and urbanity that was springing into existence in the 18th century. But we've already seen how the paintings that we have been looking at actually exist in multiple copies of very similar compositions. And this suggests that there were patrons for these paintings that were beyond just the Nawab. There must have been a market for which the artists produced these paintings, expecting that they would be bought up. Or maybe they were being made on the orders of the Nawab for gifts for people who he knew would appreciate them. But then this suggests that there were multiple collectors who would have been happy to receive them. But elite circles in Awadh at this time also included a number of Europeans who were either in the Nawab service or in the East India Company service, and they too collected and commissioned paintings. So it becomes interesting to see how they respond to these kinds of paintings when their intention for collecting doesn't have to necessarily map onto the intentions of the court itself. How does the expression of this kind of palatial architectural imagery work when it is produced for patrons who come from circles far beyond the Nawab zone? This very famous painting by the visiting artist Johann Zoffany shows a circle of very prominent Europeans in Lucknow in the 1780s. And already in the previous decade in Faizullah, a number of Europeans had entered service under the Nawab, and one of them is particularly interesting for us, and I want to end by considering works that were made for him. This interesting person was Colonel Antoine Polier, who was a French-Swiss army man and military engineer who had been in the service of the British East India Company, and he had gained a reputation for all the fantastic improvements that he had made to British Indian forts. So when Shuja'ud-Dawla requested the East India Company for a qualified engineer, Polier was seconded to Awadh, where he was appointed the chief architect and the chief engineer of the kingdom. Apart from helping to design buildings and fortifications, Polier also was involved in map making, and he offered his advice to the military as well. As a designer of buildings and fortifications, and as a surveyor and a map maker, we can think of Polier as somebody whose profession was connected with the visual, and therefore he must have had a very acute eye. He lived as a white Mughal, getting completely absorbed into Nawabi circles. And he extended his interest to paintings and calligraphy, which he collected assiduously, where again, his sharp eye helped him collect some very beautiful things. It's in paintings that are made for him by an atelier of artists whom he had hired that we see the visual logic of these Awadhi terrace scenes being carried to their logical extreme. Here, buildings and cultivated landscapes become the entire raison d'etre for the works. They are evacuated of human presence, or the figures when they occur are almost ant-like presences dwarfed by the immensity of space. Polier commissioned a number of paintings that he knew would be well liked because he had multiple copies made of them, some of which he gifted to powerful people. Polier fell out of favor in Awadh because he became too close to that Mughal crown prince in exile. And eventually he left the Nawab and was employed directly by the Mughals. And when the Mughal gained his throne and became Shah Alam, Polier accompanied him when he was finally able to return to Delhi. The scholar of late Mughal painting, Yutika Sharma, has written very insightfully of a few paintings from Polier's collection which record this moment of return. She calls them the Bazgasht paintings, the paintings of the going back to origin. The paintings that she discusses that are now in the Victoria and Albert Museum were probably made at the instance of Polier. And in this one that we're seeing, Shah Alam's entourage is winding its way to Delhi, whose citadel is rendered in great detail in the far background in these very delicate tints. The second painting that she discusses in this context is a very well-known, highly idealized view of the fort of Delhi, taking that same kind of angle of vision that we have seen in the Awadh terrace scenes. Keeping the Shah Burj or the imperial pavilion at its center here, the painting unfolds with a kind of an unreal symmetry for which the actual details of the fort's architecture have to be edited because the actual structure was not as bilaterally symmetrical as this painting suggests. But in this marvelous painting, it is one detail that is heart-stopping that occurs at lower right as Shah Alam prepares to enter into the Diwan-e-Khas, that very special hall of special audience, for the very first time after his long exile. Attendants are there with the insignia of royalty attending upon him. Somebody waves a platter of auspicious incense for this moment as he takes these momentous steps. And yet one wonders, what was it for this artist for whom depicting this entire sweeping view from a bird's eye perspective took precedence over highlighting this incredibly important event? What a distance the artist has traveled from the moment of Shah Jahan, where paintings were scaled to show the emperor dominating the grand audience hall that he had built. Here, the Mughal emperor is only the tiniest detail in the architectural vista that has been created by his forebears. What should we be reading into this image? But the very fact that the miniaturization of the king in this painting tells us something about the dwindling significance of the Mughals as anything but the producers of fine buildings, works of art, or simply being a source of visual pleasure. That's all the king is now, just a little speck of an entertaining detail in a field of visual delights. Let me end here. I thank you for your indulgence.
Thank you so much. Oh, sorry.
You go first.
Okay, thank you. I think we're both rushing to thank you, Kavita. That was, I think I speak for many of us today. I've been bowled over by your presentation, and I know many people have been absolutely gripped because it's a little longer than usual, and we're all still here in full force.
Sorry.
No, not at all. It's been hypnotic and absolutely wonderful. I know some people had to leave a bit early and sent their regrets, but I think there are a few questions which have emerged and which I think Helen will take. But again, let me say that it's been a real pleasure and a delight and a great education listening to you this morning for us here in New York. So with that, I hand over to Helen.
Thank you so much, Kavita. I just want to add my thanks. I've watched it twice because I watched it yesterday too, and I just love your visuals were just absolutely stunning. So thank you so much. Your first question in the chat is from Navina. She says, thank you for this wonderful talk that makes us look at this material in a new way. Do you think that European techniques of perspectival recession played a significant role in the cultivation of deep space in 18th century painting?
So thank you for that, Navina. And of course, European techniques did play a tremendous role, but they had been available since the 1570s, at least, if not earlier in India, with the arrival of prints and so on. And we now even have scholars who tell us that much earlier there was a traffic in images. And we've seen right through Mughal painting and late Mughal painting, and through a lot of the Rajput painting and Deccani painting, we've seen a fascination with space and with perspective, which is played with in different ways and often selectively. Here, I think something quite manic is happening, and it's connected to all of these sort of political changes that are happening to the nature of place, I believe. But there is another element that I didn't manage to fit in. The talk was getting away from me. It was already so long. So if you don't mind, I can share my screen and quickly show you something else that I think was going on, which actually is her name, Sonika Soni, who's worked on Jaipur paintings. Talked about in one of her talks, and that kind of fascinated me. So do I have permission to share screen?
Yes, you should be able to. It's just the green button in the middle.
Okay, I hope I have the right PowerPoint up. Yeah. Okay, so you may have noticed something a little bit odd about some of these paintings that I didn't remark on, where there are these very strange circles. Yeah, there are these circles which are hovering at the top of the painting, and it occurs more than once. So in the previous one, you had the circle covered over with paper and then sort of badly repainted to kind of integrate it with the sky, but not quite. You have this other painting which shows a scene from Delhi, and it has a cutout. This is actually a hole. And here in this painting, you can see that there was a hole, but the whole upper part of the painting seems to have been trimmed. I can't explain why that happens, but Shivani Sood, who has just done her PhD on paintings from Jaipur, has talked about a lot of interest at approximately the same time in these deep perspectival scenes in Jaipur as well. And she associates them with the arrival of certain kinds of optical toys. And there's a particular one called the zogroscope that she talks about, which was a very popular visual entertainment in the 18th century, in which you had scenes like this, which are these deep perspectival scenes, which were produced in prints for sale. And when you fitted them in the zogroscope, it sort of magically exaggerated and turned the scene into a three-dimensional scene. So, it's like the stereoscope when photography comes and you have two photographs merging. I think this has some play with lenses, which changes things. Now, I'm not saying that these paintings were produced for zogroscope, but when I heard Shivani's talk and she was showing paintings made in Jaipur, which were like this, and she believed that they were made for zogroscopes, it made me wonder that there must be some optical toy somewhere like this. I've forgotten the name of this, but this is some other kind of optical toy in which you slotted in these little circular things. And it made me think that somewhere out there, there is some sort of a optical toy waiting for us to discover, which may have needed holes cut out in these paintings for the paintings to be fitted in, for their perspectives to go even more nuts than they already are. So this is totally a conjecture, but these holes make me think that perhaps it was yet another level of perspectival play coming out of Europe, but this time through technologies, which might also affect the making of these paintings. So I hope that answers Naveena's question somewhat.
Thank you.
Sorry, I was wondering what those holes were because I kept seeing them and
Yeah. But I have to say, I've never seen any of these paintings in the flesh. So I'm only guessing that the holes are all the same size. It's all sort of just looking at stuff on the net. So someone who can get their hands on these needs to measure these holes and tell us whether they could have been used to hold these paintings in some sort of a, like maybe a rod they're suspended from, and then they get flipped across a lens or something, something like that.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
That is very interesting.
You have a compliment from Mariam Akhtiar. She says, thank you for an absolutely delightful presentation. David Lelyveld says, marvelous presentation. Could you say something of how these works were presented, exhibited, and accessible? Were they preserved in albums, shown on walls, or something else?
Yeah, thank you for that. So that's a question that actually is extremely relevant to almost every manifestation of Indian courtly painting. And a lot of the times, the kinds of political meanings that we ascribe to these paintings and the political power or agency that we imagine for them gets completely undercut by the very limited nature of their circulation, because we know also that the paintings were often restricted to a very limited elite viewership. So it was sort of like preaching to the converted, speaking to the already loyal noblemen or very close associates of, who are already closely allied with the crown of that particular place. That being said, there were also paintings on walls. And whoever would have access, again, we're talking about chambers in palaces. But if we go to palaces that are extant in places like Udaipur, we see how completely covered with paintings of these very elaborate kinds a number of the courtyards and the audience halls were. And so that would have had some larger kind of scope of visibility for people. And we cannot talk about that in quite the same way in some of these provincial Mughal places, because the great palaces that were made, and which we know through the work of my former PhD student and this really bright upcoming star of a scholar, Parul Singh, whom I've thanked in many of the slides. She has worked on 19th century Awadh, and she tells us about how some of the great palaces that were built under the successors of Asaf-ud-Daula were actually opened in big public festivals to the entire public, from the beggar upwards on certain days of the year. Now, were those walls also painted with the kinds of paintings we see in a place like Jaipur or Udaipur? We don't know, because that palace is destroyed by the British as a kind of revenge for what happened in the mutiny over there. But perhaps it was. But one of the big gifts of our era has been the digitization of museum collections, because in the 80s and even in the 90s, when we used to depend entirely on printed catalogs to know what a museum collection was like, we were only shown a very small selection of the very finest paintings, because you had to choose what you were going to print in your catalog. And with the coming of digitization, actually all the crap creeps onto the catalog, the digital catalog as well, right? And for me, that's one of the most exciting gifts that has come, because it actually tells you not just about the highest achievement, but it gives you a picture of painting as practice in a place. And so it shows you the first rate, the second rate, the third rate, the fourth rate. It shows you copy after copy, so where we would have only been publishing the original, we look at like the third copy after something. And that tells us something about the presence and the circulation of images in society in circles far wider than we had initially imagined, when we only imagined that it was, the crown prince sitting with his consort, or the crown prince sitting with his favorite poet, and they're passing books to each other in these very refined mehfils that we see depicted in Mughal painting. Actually, the circulation of image is much broader than that, and probably was also entering the hands of merchant class people as well. Again, we know that from new work that has come out, that has looked at archives, which has looked at how paintings were collected. So you get to hear about a flourishing art market in the 18th century in various centers, where there were already dealers who were selling artwork. So it wasn't just one captive set of painters working exclusively for the court, but painting as a phenomenon in society was larger. And looking at the lower quality paintings, like I was saying, like let's just look at the migration of motifs, not just at the quality of the brushwork. So when we look at the migration of motifs, you really get a sense of the reproductions of the image, the ideas of the image traveling far and wide.
Thank you so much. We have a few more comments and then one or two more questions, but since we are running a little past the hour, we don't want to keep you, so just so that you know. So Nancy Micklewright says, Kavita, thank you for a completely brilliant talk and best regards from Washington. I apologize for having to leave early. Elena Werner says, brilliant talk, thank you. Savita Monet says, thank you for your marvelous talk. I was fascinated by the vintage point of the artist. Were these elevated / aerial views purely imagined, or would they have had access to such a view, perhaps atop a minaret?
Possibly, no drones then, unfortunately, but so possibly climbing onto a high structure gives you an idea of how to organize the space, but possibly equally it is prints that are coming from different parts of the world. You know, it doesn't have to only be the West. You could also think of prints coming from points east, from Japan and China and so on. So the idea of a bird's eye view and organizing space in that way would be coming not just from direct observation, but actually from the model of other painted or printed representations of architectural space, which we see that there is a great zest for, right? When we were looking at the zogroscope prints that were imported from Europe, those also really revel in space.
Thank you. Daniel Enbaum says, great talk as ever, Kavita. Elena Werner has a follow-up question. She says, I was very interested in the connection you drew between property law and the development of architecture. Can you please say more about that?
Actually, I can't say much more about that, but Ebba Koch's works I very warmly recommend to you because she is the one who has worked this out. And I think it has just absolutely stunning consequences for our understanding of architecture and what survives. So please do read. There's more than one article. She has put almost everything that she has written up on her academia.edu page. And oh my goodness, she's the best. I mean, every article has so much insight in it. Please do take a look at it.
Thank you. And then we're going to close out with one last wonderful compliment from Banu Parpia, who says, thanks for a very insightful and enjoyable presentation, Kavita. Your theses / hypotheses are very compelling. I look forward to future contributions to the literature by you as you develop these conjectures. So I want to just join in with everyone else and say thank you again.
Thank you, Kavita. Yes, I'll just add my thanks to Helen and to everybody else, and to say that we really enjoyed our time with you, Kavita. Thank you so much. We'll keep closely in touch as we always do, but thank you for this valuable morning. Thank you, Helen, for all that you've done to organize it. And thanks to the Lavori Sterling Foundation for their ongoing support of this series. It's a marvelous hour we spent together. And Helen, can you remind us next week what we're looking forward to?
Yes, so next week is our final lecture in the spring 2022 series. It'll be How to Decode a Manuscript, a close look at a book of Mughal a close look at a Mughal book of poetry by Marika Sardar. So that's on May 19th at 11 a.m. New York time. So hopefully we'll see many of you there.
Mm-hmm. And one last compliment has just come in from Molly Aitken.
Yes, let me pull it up. You're just, everybody wants to compliment you, Kavita. Everyone's
thank you so much. This is kind of overwhelming, but thank you.
Yes, no problem. I lost the chat box somehow.
I'll read it out. Thank you. Splendid, brilliant, thought-provoking as ever. So that's from Molly Aitken.
Thank you so much. Have a good day, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.